Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, self-elevated spirit, culture. The Enlightenment struggle against superstition continued, as indeed it is struggling on even to this day. Right, it's very warm here. Let us see further how faith experiences the Enlightenment in the different moments of its own consciousness, to which the view mentioned above referred to only generally. These moments are pure thought, or as object absolute being in and for itself, then its relation as a knowing to absolute being, the ground of its belief, and lastly its relation to absolute being in its acts or its worship and service. Just as pure insight has failed to recognize itself and has denied itself in belief, and generally, so too in these moments it will behave in an equally perverse manner. Pure insight adopts a negative attitude to the absolute being of the believing consciousness. This being is pure thought, and pure thought posited within itself as an object or an essence, as essence. In the believing consciousness, this intrinsic being of thought acquires at the same time for consciousness, that is for itself, the form, but only the empty form of objectivity. It has the character of something presented to consciousness. To pure insight, however, since it is pure consciousness from the side of the self, that is for itself, the other appears as something negative of self-consciousness. This could still be taken either as the pure intrinsic being of thought, or also as the being of sense certainty. But since it is at the same time for the self, and the self, qua self, that has an object, is an actual consciousness, the object proper as such is, for pure insight, an ordinary thing of sense. A thing of sense certainty. That merely is. This, its object, is manifest to it in the picture thought of faith. It condemns this picture thought and in its own object. But in apprehending the object of faith as insight's own object, it already does faith a wrong. For it is saying that the absolute being of faith is a piece of stone, a block of wood, which has eyes and sees not. Or again, a piece of dough, which having come from the field is transformed by man and returned to earth again, or in whatever other ways faith anthropomorphizes absolute being, making it into an object that it can represent to itself. Enlightenment, which professes to be pure, here converts what is for spirit, eternal life, and Holy Spirit into an actual, perishable thing, and defiles it with sense certainty's view of it, a viewpoint which is essentially trivial and definitely absent from faith in its worship. So that enlightenment is completely in the wrong when it imputes the view to faith. What faith reveres is certainly does not regard as stone or wood or dough, nor any other kind of temporal sensuous thing. If enlightenment has a mind to say that, all the same, its object is also this, or even that is, essentially and in truth, this, then firstly, faith is equally well aware of that also, which, however, lies outside of its worship. Secondly, however, faith does not regard such things as stone, etc., as possessing intrinsic being. On the contrary, what has intrinsic being for faith is solely the essential being of pure thought. The second moment is the relation of faith to this absolute being as a consciousness that knows it. For faith, as a thinking pure consciousness, this being is immediately present, but pure consciousness is just as much a mediated relation of certainty to truth, a relation which constitutes the ground of faith. For enlightenment, this ground becomes equally a fortuitous knowledge of fortuitous events, but the ground of knowledge is the conscious universal, and in its truth is absolute spirit, which is in abstract pure consciousness, or in thought as such, is merely absolute being, but qua self-consciousness is knowledge of itself. Pure insight characterizes this consciousness, this conscious universal, the simple self-knowing spirit, equally as a negative of self-consciousness. It is true that pure insight is itself pure mediated, that is self-mediated thought, is a pure knowing, but since it is a pure insight, a pure knowing, that does not as yet know itself, that is not aware that it is this pure mediating movement, the mediation seems to insight, as does everything that it is itself insight, to be an other. In its realization, therefore, it develops this moment which is essential to it, but this moment seems to it to belong to faith and to have the character of something eternal, external, to pure insight, to be a fortuitous knowledge of narrative of real events, real in the ordinary sense of the word. Time for prayer. Thank you. Here, therefore, it falsely charges religious belief with basing its certainty on sense particular, historical evidences, which, considered as historical evidences, would certainly not guarantee the degree of certainty about their content which is given by newspaper accounts of any happening. Further, that is, certainty rests on the accidental preservation of these evidences. On the one hand, the preservation by means of paper, and on the other hand, by the skill and honesty of their transference from one piece of paper to another, and lastly, on the correct interpretation of the meaning of dead words and letters. In fact, however, it does not occur to faith to fasten its certainty to such evidences and such fortuitous circumstances. Faith in its certainty is an unsophisticated relationship to its absolute object, a pure knowing of it, which does not mix up letters, paper, and copyists in its consciousness of absolute being, and does not bring itself into a relation with it by means of things of that kind. On the contrary, this consciousness is the self-mediating ground of its knowledge. It is spirit itself, which bears witness to itself both in the inwardness of the individual consciousness and through the universal presence in everyone of faith in it. If faith wants to appeal to historical evidences in order to get that kind of foundation, or at least confirmation of its content that Enlightenment talks about, and seriously thinks and acts as if that were a matter of importance, then it has already let itself be corrupted by the Enlightenment, and its efforts to establish and consolidate itself in such a way are merely evidence it gives of its corruption by the Enlightenment. There still remains the third side, the relation to absolute being of consciousness as action. This action is the setting aside of the particularity of the individual or of the natural mode of its being for self, whence proceeds its certainty of being pure self-consciousness, of being in accordance with its action, and that is, as an independent individual, one with absolute being, since in action purposiveness and end are distinguished, and pure insight in relation to this action equally adopts a negative attitude, and as in the other moments denies its own self, it must, as regards purposiveness, exhibit itself as lacking in intelligence, since insight united with intention, that is, the harmony of end and means, appears to it as an other, or rather as the opposite of insight as regards the end itself, I should say. However, as regards the end itself. However, it has to make a badness, enjoyment, and possession its end, and to prove itself to be the impurest kind of intention, since pure intention qua other is equally impure intention. Accordingly, we see that as regards purposiveness, enlightenment finds it foolish when the believer gives himself the superior consciousness of not being in bondage to natural enjoyment and pleasure by actually denying himself natural enjoyment and pleasure and demonstrating by his actions that his contempt for them is no lie but is genuine. Similarly, enlightenment finds it foolish that the individual absolves itself of its quality of being absolutely individual, excluding all others, and of possessing property of its own, by itself giving up its property, for thereby it shows in truth that it is not in earnest with this isolation of itself, but is raised above the natural necessity of isolating itself. And in this absolute isolation of being for self, denying that others are the same as itself, pure insight finds both to be of no purpose as well as wrong. The purpose of showing itself to be free of pleasure and possession is not served by denying oneself pleasure and giving away a possession. In the opposite case, therefore, it will declare the man a fool who, in order to eat, has recourse to actually eating. Insight also finds it wrong to deny oneself a meal and to give away butter and eggs, not for money, nor money for butter and eggs, but simply to give them away without receiving anything in return. It declares a meal or the possession of things of that sort to be an end in itself, and hence, in fact, it declares itself to be a very impure intention which treats such enjoyment and possession as something wholly essential. Again, it also affirms as a pure intention the necessity of rising above natural existence, above acquisitiveness, about the means of existence, only it finds it foolish and wrong that this deviation should be demonstrated by deeds. In other words, this pure insight is in truth a deception which feigns and demands an inner elevation, but declares that it is superfluous, foolish, and even wrong to be in earnest about it, to put this elevation into actual practice and demonstrate its truth. Pure insight thus denies itself both as pure insight, for it denies directly a purpose of action, and as pure intention, for it denies the intention of proving itself freed from the ends of a separate individual existence. It is thus that the Enlightenment lets itself be understood by faith. It presents itself in this bad light because, just by being in relation to another, it gives itself a negative reality, or exhibits itself as the opposite of itself. But pure insight and intention must enter into this relationship, for it is their realization. This at first appeared as a negative reality. Perhaps its positive reality is better constituted. Let us see how things stand with this. If all prejudice and superstition have been banished, the question arises, what next? What is the truth Enlightenment has propagated in their state? It has already declared that this positive content is in its extirpation of error, for that alienation of itself is just as much its positive reality. In its approach to what for faith is absolute spirit interprets any determination. It discovers there as wood, stone, etc., as particular real things, since in this way it grasps in general every determinateness, that is, all content and filling, as something finite, as a human entity and a mere idea. Absolute being becomes for it a vacuum, to which no determinations, no predicates can be attributed. The attribution of predicates to such a vacuum would be in itself reprehensible, and it is just in such a union that the monstrosities of superstition have been produced. Reason, pure insight, is certainly not empty itself, since the negative of itself is for it, and is its content. On the contrary, it is rich, but rich only in particularity and limitation. To let nothing of that sort appertain to absolute being or be attributed to it, this is the prudent behaviour of reason, or pure insight, which knows how to put itself and its finite riches in their proper place, and how to deal with the absolute in a worthy manner. In contrast to this empty being, there stands as a second moment of the positive truth of enlightenment, the singleness in general of consciousness and of all being, a singleness excluded from absolute being, and in the form of absolute being in and for itself. Consciousness, which is its very first reality, is sense certainty and mere meaning, returns here to this from the whole course of its experience, and is again a knowledge of what is purely negative of itself, or of things of sense, that is, of things which immediately and indifferently confront its being for self. Here, however, it is not an immediate natural consciousness. On the contrary, it has become such for itself. Whereas at first it was at the mercy of every sort of entanglement into which it was plunged by its unfolding, and now has been led back by pure insight to its first shape. It has experienced that shape as a result, being based on the nothingness of all the other shapes of consciousness, and hence of everything beyond sense certainty. This sense certainty is no longer mere meaning, but rather absolute truth. This nothing of everything that lies beyond sense certainty is no doubt merely a negative proof of this truth, but it is not susceptible of any other, for the positive truth of sense certainty is in its own self the immediate being for self of the notion itself and object, and that too in the form of otherness, the positive truth that every consciousness is absolutely certain that it is, and that there are other real things outside of it, and that in its material being, like those things, is in and for itself, or absolute. The Father's Curse. Lastly, the third moment of the truth of enlightenment is the relation of the individual being to absolute being, is the relation between the first two moments, insight qua pure insight, of what is identified or unrestricted also goes beyond what is not identical, that is to say, beyond finite reality or beyond itself as mere otherness. For the beyond of this otherness it has the void to which, therefore, it relates, the sensuous reality. In the determination of this relation, both of the sides do not enter as content, for one of them is the void, and it is only through the other, the sensuous reality, that a content is present, but the form of the relation to be determination of which the side of the in itself contributes can be a matter of choice, for the form is something intrinsically negative, and therefore self-opposed, being as well as nothing, the in itself as well as the opposite, or what is the same thing, the relation of the actual world to the in itself, qua a beyond, is as much a negating as a positing of that actual world. Finite reality can therefore, properly speaking, be taken just as one needs. The sensuous is therefore now related positively to the absolute as to the in itself, and sensuous reality is itself an intrinsic being. The absolute makes it fosters and cherishes it, and then again it is related to the absolute as an opposite, as to its own non-being. In this relationship it is not anything in itself, but exists only for another, whereas in the preceding shape of consciousness, the notion of the antithesis were determined as good and bad. In the case of pure insight, on the other hand, they become the pure abstractions of being in itself and being for another. Both ways of viewing the positive and the negative relations of the finite to the in itself are, however, in fact equally necessary, and everything is thus as much something in itself as it is for another. In other words, everything is useful. Everything is at the mercy of everything else. Now let itself be used by others and for them, and now, so to speak, stands again on his hind legs, is standoffish towards the other, is for itself, and uses the other in its turn. From this we see what is the essence and what is the place of man, regarded as a thing that is conscious of this relation, as he immediately is as a natural consciousness per se. Man is good as an individual, he is absolute, and all else exists for him, and moreover, since the moments have for him, qua self-consciousness animal, the significance of universality, everything exists for his pleasure and delight. And as one who has come from the hand of God, he walks the earth as in a garden planted for him. He must also have plucked the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He possesses in this an advantage which distinguishes him from all other creatures. For it happens that his intrinsically good nature is also so constituted that in excess of pleasure does it harm, or rather his individuality has also its beyond within it, can go beyond itself and destroy itself. To counter this, reason is for him a useful instrument for keeping the excess within bounds, or rather for preserving himself when he oversteps his limit, for this is the power of consciousness. Enjoyment on the part of the conscious, intrinsically universal being must not itself be something determinate as regards variety and duration, but universal. A measure or proportion has therefore the function of preventing pleasure in its variety and duration from being cut short. That is, the function of measure is in moderation, but as everything is useful to man, so man is useful too, and his vocation is to make himself a member of the group, or of use for the common good, and serviceable to all. The extent which he looks after his own interests must also be matched by the extent to which he serves others, and so far as he serves others, so far is he taking care of himself. One hand washes the other, but wherever he finds himself, there he is in his right place. He makes use of others, and is himself made use of. Different things are useful to one another in different ways, but all things are mutually serviceable through their own nature, namely through being related to the Absolute in two ways, the one positive, whereby they exist entirely on their own account, and the other negative, whereby they exist for others. The relation to absolute being, or religion, is therefore, of all useful things, the supremely useful, for it is pure utility itself. It is the enduring being of all things, or their being, in and for themselves, and it is their downfall, or their being for another. To faith, of course, this positive outcome of enlightenment is as much an abomination as its negative attitude towards belief. This enlightened insight into absolute being, which sees nothing in it but just absolute being, the être supreme, that's French, by the way, pardon my French, or the void. This intention to regard everything in its immediate existence as having intrinsic being or as good, and finally to regard the relation of the individual conscious being to absolute being, a religion, as exhaustively expressed in the notion of utility. All this is for faith utterly detestable. This wisdom, peculiar to enlightenment, at the same time necessarily seems to faith to be undiluted platitude, and the confession of platitude, because it consists of knowing nothing of absolute being, or what amounts to the same thing in knowing this quite flat truism about it, just that it is only absolute being, and on the other hand, in knowing only what is finite, and moreover knowing it is truth, and thinking that this knowledge of the finite is as true, is the highest knowledge attainable. Faith has the divine right, the right of absolute self-identity, or of pure thought, as against enlightenment, and receives at its hands nothing but wrong, for enlightenment distorts all the moments of faith, changing them into something different from what they are in it. But enlightenment has only a human right as against faith, and for the support of its own truth, for the wrong it commits is the right to be non-identical, and consists in perverting and altering a right which belongs to the nature of self-consciousness, as against simple essential being or thought. But since the right of enlightenment is the right of self-consciousness, it will not only also retain its own right, so that two equal rights of spirit could be left confronting each other, neither being capable of satisfying the other, it will maintain its absolute right, because self-consciousness is the negativity of the notion, a negativity which is active not only on its own account, but which also takes within its grasp its opposite, and because faith itself is a consciousness, it will not be able to deny enlightenment its right. For enlightenment does not employ principles peculiar to itself in its attack on faith, but principles which are implicit in faith itself. Enlightenment merely presents faith with its own thoughts, which faith unconsciously lets fall apart, but which enlightenment brings together. It merely reminds faith when one of its own modes is present to it, of the others which it also has, but which it always forgets when the other one is present. Enlightenment shows itself to faith to be pure insight by the fact that in a specific moment it sees the whole and brings forward the other moment which is opposed to it, and converting one into the other brings to notice the negative essence of both thoughts, the notion. To faith it seems to be a perversion and a lie, because it points out the otherness of its moments. In doing so, it seems directly to make something else out of them than they are in their separateness. But this other is equally essential and in truth is present in the believing consciousness itself, only this does not think about it, but puts it away somewhere. Consequently, it is neither alien to faith, nor can faith disavow it. Enlightenment itself, however, which reminds faith of the opposite aspect of its separated moments, is just as little enlightened about itself. It has a purely negative attitude to faith, so far as it excludes its own content from its purity, and takes the content to be the negative of itself. It therefore neither recognizes itself in this negative, in the content of faith, nor for this reason does it bring the two thoughts together, the one which it puts forward itself, and the one which it opposes the first, and the one which opposes the first, the one to which it opposes the first. Since it does not recognize that what it condemns in faith is directly its own thought, it is itself in the antithesis of the two moments, only one of which, namely in every case the one opposed to faith, it acknowledges but separates the other from the first, just as faith does. Consequently, enlightenment does not produce the unity of both, or their unity, as the unity, that is, the notion, but that is the notion. But the notion, not nation, notion, that should say, but the notion comes into being for it and of its own accord. In other words, enlightenment finds the notion there merely as something given for itself, in itself. The realization of pure insight is just this, that insight, whose essence is the notion, at first becomes for itself an absolute other and repudiates itself. For the antithesis of the notion is an absolute antithesis, and then out of this otherness it comes to itself, or to its notion. But enlightenment is only this movement. It is the still unconscious activity of the pure notion, an activity which, though it does arrive at its object, takes it to be an other, and too does not know the nature of the notion, namely that it is the undifferentiated which absolutely sunders itself. As against faith, then, insight is the might of the notion, insofar as it is the movement and the relating of the moments lying asunder in its consciousness, a relating in which their contradiction comes to light. Herein lies the absolute right of the authority which insight exercises over faith. But the reality on which it exercises this authority lies just in the fact that the believing consciousness is itself the notion, and therefore itself acknowledges the opposite aspect, which insight puts before it. Insight, therefore, retains its right as against faith, because it makes valid in faith what is necessary to faith itself, and what faith possesses in itself. At first, enlightenment affirms this moment of the notion, that it is an act of consciousness opposing faith. It maintains that the absolute being of faith is a being of the believer's own consciousness qua itself, or that this absolute being is a product of consciousness. To faith, its absolute being, while it is possessed of intrinsic being for the believer, is also at the same time not like an alien being, which is just found in him, no one knowing how and whence it came. On the contrary, the faith of the believer consists just in his finding himself as the particular personal consciousness in the absolute being, and his obedience and service consist in producing through his own activity that being as his own absolute being. Enlightenment, strictly speaking, only reminds faith of this. If faith roundly asserts that the inner self of absolute being is beyond the activity of consciousness, but while enlightenment, it is true, corrects the one-sidedness of faith by bringing to its notice the opposite moment of action, in contrast to being, and it is being which faith is alone thinking of here, and yet does not itself bring its own thoughts together. It isolates the pure moment of action and asserts that the inner self of faith is only a product of consciousness. This action, taken in isolation and opposed to the inner self, is, however, a contingent action, and qua an activity of picture thinking, is a creating of fictions, picture thoughts, which possess no intrinsic being, and this is how enlightenment regards the content of faith. But conversely, pure insight equally says the reverse. In maintaining the moment of otherness which the notion has within it, it pronounces absolute being to be for faith something which in no way concerns consciousness, lies beyond it, is alien to it, and unknown. The case is similar with faith. On the one hand, it puts its trust in absolute being, and in doing so obtains the certainty of itself. On the other hand, for faith, absolute being is unsearchable in all its ways, and in its being unattainable. Further, enlightenment maintains against the believer a right which the latter himself concedes when enlightenment regards the object of the believer's veneration as stone and wood, or else as something finite and anthropomorphic. For since the consciousness is divided within itself, having a beyond of the real world and a world that is altogether this side of the world, beyond itself, this side of the world beyond, there is, as a matter of fact also, present in it this view of the thing of sense according to which it counts as a being that is in and for itself. But faith does not bring together these two thoughts of absolute being, which is for it at one time pure essence and at another time an ordinary thing of sense. Even its pure consciousness is affected by the latter view, for the differences of the supersensible world, because this is without the notion, as a series of independent shapes, and their movement is a happening, and that is, they exist only in picture thinking, and have within them the marks of sensuous existence. Enlightenment on its side equally isolates the actual world as an entity forsaken by spirit, isolates determinateness as unmoved finitude, as if it were not even a moment in the spiritual movement of essential being, not nothing, but also not something that absolutely is, but something that is evanescent. It is clear that the same is the case with the ground of knowledge. Faith itself acknowledges a contingent knowledge, for it has a relationship to contingent things. And absolute being itself exists, for faith, in the form of a pictorial representation of a common reality. Consequently, the believing consciousness, too, is a certainty which does not possess the truth within itself, and it confesses itself to be such an unessential consciousness, to be of this world and separated from the spirit, that is certain of itself and self-authenticated. But it forgets this moment in its immediate spiritual knowledge of absolute being. Enlightenment, however, which reminds it of this in its turn, thinks only of contingent being and forgets the other things. It forgets the other, thinks only of the mediation which takes place through an alien third term, not of the mediation in which the immediate is itself the third term, through which it mediates itself with the other, namely with its own self. Yes, that is the reason for the father's curse. The son is off to join the army, against his father's wishes. This was a painting much admired by Diderot. Jean-Baptiste Corrèze. Finally, Enlightenment in its view of the action of faith finds the rejection of enjoyment and possessions wrong and purposeless. As to the rejection being wrong, Enlightenment is in agreement with faith on this point, for faith itself acknowledges this reality of possessing, holding on to, and enjoying property. In holding on to property, its behaviour is all the more self-centred and stubborn, and in its enjoyment it is all the more crudely self-abandoned, since its religious act of giving up possessions and enjoyment falls on the far side of this reality and purchases freedom for itself on that side. The service of sacrifice of natural impulses and enjoyments has in fact, owing to this antithesis, no truth. Retention occurs along with sacrifice. The latter is merely a symbol which performs a real sacrifice on only a small portion, and is therefore, in point of fact, only a sacrifice in imagination. As regards purposiveness, Enlightenment finds it inept to throw away one possession in order to know and to prove that one is liberated from all possessions, to deny oneself one enjoyment in order to know and to prove that one is liberated from all enjoyment. Faith itself apprehends the absolute action in a universal action. Not only is the action of its absolute being as its object a universal action for faith, but the individual consciousness too has to show that it is liberated entirely and generally from its sensual nature. But throwing away a single possession or renouncing a single enjoyment is not a universal action, and since in the action the purpose, which is a universal purpose, and the performance, which is a single performance, would be bound to present themselves to consciousness as essentially incompatible, that action shows itself to be one in which consciousness has no part, and this the kind of action is seen to be really too naive to be an action at all. It is too naive to fast in order to prove that one is liberated from the pleasures of the table, too naive to rid the body of another pleasure, as Origen did, in order to show that the pleasure is finished and done with. Origen castrated himself, by the way, because of a passage in the New Testament which I can't remember offhand. The action itself proves to be an external and single operation, but desire is rooted inwardly and is a universal. Its pleasure disappears neither with the instrument nor by abstention from particular pleasures. But Enlightenment, on its side, here isolates the inward, the unreal, as opposed to reality, just as it held fast to the externality of the thing as opposed to the inwardness of faith in the latter's contemplation and devotion. It places the essential factor in the intention, in the thought, and thereby saves itself the trouble of actually accomplishing the liberation from natural aims. On the contrary, this inwardness is itself the formal element which has its filling in the natural impulses, which are justified simply by the fact that they are inward, that they belong to universal being, to nature. Enlightenment, then, holds as an irresistible authority over faith because in the believer's own consciousness are found the very moments which Enlightenment has established as valid. Examining the effect of this authority more closely, its behaviour towards faith seems to rend asunder the beautiful unity of trust and immediate certainty, to pollute its spiritual consciousness with mean thoughts of sensuous reality, to destroy the soul which is composed and secure in its submission by the vanity of the understanding and of the self-will and self-fulfillment. But, as a matter of fact, the result of the Enlightenment is rather to do away with the thoughtless, or rather non-notional, separation which is present in faith. The believing consciousness weighs and measures by a twofold standard. It has two sorts of eyes, two sorts of ears, speaks to two voices, has duplicated all ideas without comparing the twofold meanings. In other words, faith lives in two sorts of non-notional perceptions. The one, the perceptions of the slumbering consciousness, which lives purely in non-notional thoughts. The other, those of the waking consciousness, which lives solely in the world of sense, and in each of them it has its own separate housekeeping. The Enlightenment illuminates the heavenly world with ideas belonging to the world of sense, and points out this finitude which faith cannot deny, because it is self-consciousness, and hence is the unity to which both kinds of ideas belong, and in which they do not fall apart, for they belong to the same indivisible unitary self, into which faith has passed. As a result, faith has lost the content which filled its element, and collapses into a state in which it moves listlessly to and fro within itself. It has been expelled from its kingdom, or this kingdom has been ransacked. Since the waking consciousness has monopolized every distinction and expansion of it, and has vindicated Earth's ownership of every portion of it, and given them back to Earth. Yet faith is not on that account satisfied, for this illumination has everywhere brought to light only single separate entities, so that what speaks to spirit is only a reality without any substance, and a finitude forsaken by spirit, since faith is without any content and it cannot remain in this void, or since in going beyond the finite, which is the sole content, it finds only the void. It is a sheer yearning. Its truth, an empty beyond, for which a fitting content can no longer be found, for everything is bestowed elsewhere. Faith has, in fact, become the same as enlightenment, namely the consciousness of the relation of what is in itself finite to an absolute without predicates, as absolute, unknown and unknowable. But there is this difference. The latter is satisfied enlightenment, but faith is unsatisfied enlightenment. However, we shall see whether enlightenment can remain satisfied. The yearning of the troubled spirit, which mourns over the loss of its spiritual world, lurks in the background. Enlightenment itself bears within it this blemish of an unsatisfied yearning as pure object in its empty absolute being, as action and movement, in going beyond its individual self to an empty and unfulfilled beyond, as an object with a content, in the lack of selfhood in the thing that is useful. Enlightenment will rid itself of this blemish. A closer examination of the positive result, which is its truth, will show that in that result the blemish is in principle already removed. The priest and the widow. I bet he has an unsatisfied yearning. Yes, indeed. A yearning for something beyond. I know what's in his mind. Or perhaps I'm just projecting.